So what we've discussed so far is a little bit about what separability is, and a little bit about what situatedness is, and the idea that we are creatures that get to be our separable selves through our relations, and that when we mistakenly drift into too much of one or too much of the other, too much separability or too much situatedness, the outcomes are not good. They're not good because they are essentially violating the way we are as creatures, as human beings. So my call for relationality, which is the separable person amid relationships, it's not one or the other, but both at the same time, producing each other. It's not, my call for relationality is not to be politically correct or nice. It's because I think that we are biologically and ontologically creatures of separability-amid-situatedness. That we have to take both into account because that is the way we are set up. And when we have too much of one or too much of the other, we actually are violating the setup. So I'd like to talk about the alternative, separability amid situatedness, or distinction amid relation. I'll use both terms throughout our discussions together. The idea of separability amid-situatedness holds together each person's singular visions and concerns and a common infrastructure that supports each person. It would create an ontology to ethics paradigm or program. That would be a framework for our societal, economic, political policies that would set the aims and mores of markets, civil society, and government. Would set those into the reality of our uniqueness amid our interdependence. I want to make a small warning note. Relational theologies are not relativism. It's not that in taking everybody into consideration, all ideas are equally productive. It is true that the accumulation of our plural efforts to come and understand the human condition are situated in the planet, whether we use theology or philosophy or other ways to come and understand our world. It is true that the accumulation of all our multiple efforts to discover how the world works is, in fact, how we discover it. Yet, the thing that we are struggling to understand, the thing about which our understanding is multiple, we all have a different perspective, that thing is our situation, is our ontology. We are all coming with different perspectives, but we are all trying to understand the setup that we human beings are in. We cannot say just anything about it. Saying just anything is not multiculturalism, but prejudice. Saying just anything before studying and looking at what is actually there. For example, claims that do not account for what's actually in the world. Well, water boils at 50 degrees Celsius. It's a claim. It doesn't take very good account of the reality that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Or the claim that true success needs no help from others. These claims might be claims that people have, but they are not they will not yield productive outcomes because they don't account for what's there. And when we study our human condition, we will all have multiple perspectives, but the thing we're trying to get at is our human condition, and we can't just make things up. We have to account for what is there in the same way as that if you try to sterilize surgical instruments at 50 degrees Celsius, you will come to very poor outcomes. Relational theologies, I mentioned, would yield an ontology or worldview to ethics paradigm or program. So the ethics that it would yield is not necessarily a prescription or a law code, but a process of reciprocal consideration worthiness. Reciprocal consideration worthiness, taking the concerns of the distinct and unique other to be as worthy of consideration of one's own concerns, hopes, plans, fears, and to be accounted for as your own hopes, plans, fears, anxieties, visions are to be accounted. Again, the supposed guru of greed, Adam Smith, proposed just this. He said that in markets, as in all of society, each, and now I'm quoting Adam Smith, should endeavor as much as he can to put himself in the situation of the other and to bring home to himself every little circumstance of distress which can possibly occur to the other, the sufferer. Close quote. Reciprocal consideration worthiness brings out two things: our common needs, goals, future, interests, and our differences. Differences. If we are to engage one another from a position of relationality, a position of separability amid our situatedness, our differences need to be approached by, in Joel Hunter's words, asking, and I love this quote from Joel Hunter, why the other side is for the other side. Step one, we will discover differences. Well, why is the other side for the other side? What are their concerns, fears, hopes, assumptions to be accounted for as your own are? And you begin to work out solutions from there. But without that as step one, people just dig in their heels and see to their own self-interest or their own party or their own firm. Karl Rahner calls this, the German Catholic theologian Karl Rahner calls this unity indifferent. James Olthuis refers to it non-oppositional difference. Catherine Keller and Laurel Schneider call it entangled or connected difference. So let me give you a practical example. Let's imagine a timber firm. The question for the timber firm and its employees who want to keep their jobs might not be whether it is legal for the timber firm to continue to cut down trees against the protests of the local community and environmental groups. I'm going to suggest that's not the question, because that question is already an adversarial setup. The question might be to recognize that loggers, shareholders in the corporation, management, also have interests in forests surviving to the next generation of building materials, jobs, and profits. So what would the outcome look like if all those involved, owners, managing shareholders, employees, town residents, environmental protection organizations, and so on, believed in the way we believe we breathe, that discussion begins with why is the other side for the other side, and taking that as consideration worthy. No one leaves the discussion until all have contributed substantially to the solution, and until the solution is developed where no one's concerns are sidelined. What would the outcome of our discussions be like if that's just the way it was done? If that was just what one did? If it didn't occur to anybody to do anything else but to begin by asking why is the other side for the other side, and brokering that into the solution with the idea that we have common interests now, and very importantly, a common future on the planet. What if that was just the way people did things? I also want to say at this point that this is not to say that this will be achieved in a paradise-like consensus absent law. Law expresses societal values, it is important, and it is a procedure to be used when the usual means of addressing problems fail. That is, law follows from the culture of the society. Law expresses what's valuable and who's valuable, what deserves protection and what does not deserve protection, what is considered a crime, what is considered a proportional punishment. All of these things, these ostensibly legal things, flow out of the society and culture and express society in culture. So law could emerge from a society that was very adversarial, where people followed what Eli Wald and Russell Pierce, both law professors in the United States, call a culture of autonomous self-interest. Everybody out to get as much as they possibly can, just skirting inside the law, where lawyers are considered as sort of hired guns to try to get away with as much as possible. All law can emerge from a society that sees private interests as embedded in the future and commonalities of all of the society. So it's not a question of some imagined politically correct consensus. That's not what relationality and theologies of relationality look towards. Law is a foundation of society. It's a question of what the societal values are that feed into the legal system and what the self-understanding of lawyers is. Is it autonomous self-interest and as a hired gun? Or is it someone who contributes also to the future of the society we're in? So far, I've been talking a little bit on the sociological side, and I'd like to now start talking a little bit more about the philosophy or the worldview and the theology of relationality. I'd like to begin with what I've learned a little bit about subatomic particles, which, as it turns out, have trajectories, each of which is determined or formed by responding to the trajectories of other subatomic particles. Now, I'm simplifying because I'm not a subatomic physicist. But it's interesting that the very basis of matter in our universe is of distinct subatomic particles that are actually formed in interaction. You know from the Heisenberg principle also that they're formed by interaction of the observer. And you may know that not only by what the observer watching it, but if the observer is looking for location, you'll find a location. If an observer is looking for speed of motion, you'll find speed of motion. That the actual thing you're looking for is formed by the observer's interaction and intentions vis-a-vis that little subatomic particle. And we're just beginning to understand post-quantum physics. In this sense, distinction amid relation is basic to existence. In the human realm, persons too are distinct. Even identical twins differ in character and conduct. If you know any, you'll know that to be true. Yet distinctiveness, as I said, emerges from interaction, beginning with one's earliest caretakers. While distinct, we are, as Donald Pfaff holds, the evolutionary biologist, we are set up for relationship. We are, in his words, wired for goodwill as a matter of evolution. Reciprocal altruism antedates formal institutions, Edwin Scott Fruwald explains. And reciprocal altruism appears to be hardwired into human brains. In other words, there is a universal grammar of reciprocity, just like there is a universal grammar of language. Close quote. This reciprocity structures not only dyadic exchange or family relations where you might expect it, but it also structures complex societal networks and, importantly, relationships among highly mobile persons without long-term bonds. And were it otherwise, our species would have killed each other, and we would have killed each other off. We're wired for cooperation. There is no person who is not informed by her surroundings. There is no one who forms herself fresh from the start by herself on her own with no relations, no surroundings, and no culture. Or as the American theologian Stanley Hoyerwas quips, the I formed myself de novo idea is the story we have in the modern West, the story that you should have no story except the story you chose when you had no story. Yeah? The theological idea that undergirds separability amid situatedness begins with the analogia entis by Thomas Aquinas, or analogous participation. This is expressed in various ways in the Abrahamic traditions, and I will focus here on three parts of analogous participation. The ideas of co-creatorship, being in the image of God, the Tselem Elohim in Hebrew, or Imago Dei in Latin, and the analogy of being itself. Let's start with the analogy of being itself. What does that mean? As explained by Ibn Sina, the medieval Muslim philosopher Maimonides, the medieval Jewish philosopher Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic medieval philosopher, and Nicholas of Cusa, 15th century vicar of the papal and the papal states. God, it goes like this. God is very different from anything in the world. God is not a thing, and it's not a force like gravity, only bigger. God is the reason everything exists. There could be nothing, but there's something. The reason that there is existence itself is what some people call God. So, individual forces like magnetism or gravity, and individual things like people, are very different from this foundation for everything called God. Yet in spite of this difference, none of us can exist without having, I'm being a little metaphorical here, by having within us a bit of God, a bit of what makes everything exist. If we didn't have something of that, we wouldn't exist at all. One way of saying this is we are in God's image. We have something of the foundation for existence in us in order to exist. Aquinas called this God being intimate in us, or innermost in all things. We are not like God directly, but we are analogous expressions of the foundation for all existence. We are to the source of existence, God, like an analogy to its referent. We have an underlying of kindness, in this case existence, an underlying of kindness with the source of existence, and yet we are radically different in appearance and particular features. This is the idea of analogous participation. We participate or have something of the source of existence in us in order to exist, but we are radically different from that grounding for existence and express something of it analogously. There's something of existence itself in us, though we have very different characteristics and very different features from that foundation and from each other. In order to understand this a little better, we can think of energy and matter. All beings have energy and matter. We partake of energy and matter. And each particular thing is a particular instance or example of what energy and matter can be. That's a kind of analogy. Similarly, all persons participate in distinction amid relation. We are differentiated beings, constituted by relation, and have reciprocal impact and responsibility. Each particular worldly instance of distinction amid relation is one possibility of what existence can be. In short, we are radically different from whatever the foundation is for existence, yet we are in intimate relation to it. So intimate, it is inherent in us. So existence is radical difference from the source of being, from the source of everything, and yet intimate relation with the source of anything. Existence itself is a matter of distinction, difference, separateness from the source of being, and yet intimate relation with the source of being. Existence itself is a matter of distinction amid relation, or separability-amid-situatedness. And that's why when I describe subatomic particles, they're also unique and distinct and in relation. And when I describe human beings or children as they're born, they are all distinct and yet develop in relation. Because existence itself is a matter of distinction amid relation. This means that we humans are also distant from each other and in profound relation to each other. Why? Because that's the setup. That's what existing is. Without this dual quality, we wouldn't exist. Now this separateness but relatedness is not I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, but something much deeper, something more like a covenant. The bond that protects not private interests as contracts do, but the bond that protects long-term relations and our ability to work together to solve problems and to develop policies for a better future. Our mutual impact is unavoidable, and it means mutual responsibility. So I've talked a little bit about analogy of participation, that we are very different from the foundation of existence, God, and yet in intimate relation with whatever that is, without which we wouldn't exist at all. The idea of being in God's image, Imago Dei, Tselem Elohim, also considers each person as unique, yet having of a deep relation, of a one-of-a-kindness with existence itself. On one hand, God is distinct from us and has made each of us distinct. The Talmud has a very nice expression. When a man casts many coins from a single mold, they all resemble one another. But when the supreme being fashioned each man in the mold of the first man, none of them resembles another. We are all unique. And yet, something of the spirit of the foundation of being inheres in each one of us. God is transcendent in relationship, Terence Fretheim notes. Transcendent, yet in relationship with everything that exists and each person that exists. God, the foundation for existence, has created a world, I'm continuing with Terence Fretheim, has created a world in which interrelatedness is basic to the nature of reality. We see this in scriptural narrative as well. God judged Adam alone as not good and created Eve. God created relationship as the structure of human living. There is no way to be outside of our distinction and yet relation. That's the setup. The idea that we are in God's image tells us that not only that our separateness yet situatedness is a condition of our existence, but that also that each of us, given free will, has the capacity to choose relation, has the capacity to choose to live in congruence with our separability amid situation, to live in accord with our separability amid situatedness. Because being in God's image grants us moral correspondence. In Latin, similitudo, in Hebrew, dmut Elohim. It's a morality that is human, and thus radically different from the divine, but it is in correspondence with the source of all existence. And we have the capacity to act in correspondence, in some sense, with the setup, with the separability amid situatedness setup. We have the ability to do that. Some ask whether this pertains to evil persons as well. And relational theologies respond that it does, but it has been tragically perverted. If it didn't apply to evil persons, there would be no moral issue at hand. The question is not whether something that starts out evil is through and through evil, remains evil. There's no moral question there. The question with evil is how a person empowered with the capacity for relation and consideration worthiness of others nonetheless perpetrates evil. How is it that someone with our capacity to act in moral correspondence with the setup, with situatedness, embedding our separability, nonetheless doesn't act that way? Now that's the moral question, right? As opposed to something that is just evil to begin with. There's no moral dilemma there. In sum, being in the image of God, partaking of his distinction amid relation, makes each person distinctly worthy of consideration and able to give consideration. That's our moral correspondence. As agents of free will, we may reject or ignore this. Indeed, the concept of sin may be taken as the disregard or the rupture of our relationality, of our separability amid situatedness, both separability and situatedness. Yet even when we disregard it, we retain the capacity for it nonetheless. And without this, humanity would not be morally accountable. Without the relational capacity of distinct persons, there would be no moral issue. So far we have discussed the analogy of being, and we have discussed being in God's image. The third principle that I said helps enrich our concept of relationality is co-creatorship, and it builds on moral correspondence. We have the capacity to work in correspondence analogously to God within our human talents to further a flourishing world. That is, we have sufficient moral capacity to be God's co-creators. The analogia entis, the analogy of being, explains this as the principle of secondary causes. As Aquinas wrote, God holds or contains all that is possible, including the natural processes by which the world runs. Humanity, in analogous secondary role, acts secondarily to make particular things happen from these basic principles. That is something like God's co-creator. The classic example from Thomas Aquinas is God God the reasons for all things, for existence itself, and for each particular thing makes things like the chemicals that we have, as opposed to other possible chemicals, how they interact, as opposed to other possible interactions, things like heat, moisture, and human beings secondarily make plants grow. Now that's a classic example of what it means to act secondarily as God's co-creator and in moral correspondence. There's a certain optimism in the analogy of being and in the idea that we are in God's image, because they suggest that if we go with the grain of the setup, if we sort of go with distinction amid relation, if relationality and reciprocal consideration worthiness is not blocked, human thriving is more likely. There's a certain optimism in that. If we go with the grain, human thriving and flourishing is more likely. William Desmond calls this the incognito work of grounding trust. The incognito work of grounding trust. Conversely, a breach of relationality goes against the grain and gums up the gears. At the subatomic level, the failure to take other particles' trajectories into account would collapse all matter. Among human beings, the failure to take others into account yields neglect, abuse, disease, resource grabbing, waste of talent, and societal instability. In other words, the theology of relationality is a theology of the way things are, and it yields an ethics of how not to mess things up. Yoram Hazony holds this theology to ethics to be the central biblical import, the point of the Bible. He writes, "There exists a law whose force is of a universal nature, because it derives from the way the world itself is made, and therefore from the natures of men and nations in this world." Close quote. And this brings me back to what I said a few minutes ago. I'm not talking about relational theologies in order to be politically correct or trendy with the latest political program or to be nice. I'm talking about it because I think it's the setup. And I think when we violate the setup, we come to outcomes that are very, very much worse than if we were to use our separability-amid-situatedness as a framework for our societal organization. When we think about a relational worldview and how that might yield a relational ethics, consider something, again, that's going wrong where you live, in your country, or in the larger world. List all of the parties involved. Discuss the position each party takes and why it takes this position. Do this for all involved. How can you address as many of the concerns as possible? Be as creative as you can. What needs to change? Where do other people have to compromise, and where do you? When we consider the physics and biology of relationality, how does this science differ from claims about the selfish gene? Imagine two sets of early Homo sapiens, one wired for cooperation or reciprocal altruism, and one wired for competition and aggression. How would these two sets obtain food, mate, conduct childcare, handle encounters with other groups, and so on? What would the survival chances be for each group? When we consider relational theology and the analogy of being, there could be nothing, but there's something. There's also the specific somethings that there are: natural forces, subatomic particles, molecules, quanta, dark matter, chemical interactions, and so on. Why is that? What's the difference between whatever is the source of everything and any specific thing, or between that source and you. When we consider relational theology and the idea of being in God's image, the concept of moral correspondence, and the concept of co-creatorship, the idea of being God's image, in God's image, has been proposed as a metaphor for the analogy of being where we are not the same as the source of everything, but have something of this source analogously in us, so to speak. Is this a useful metaphor? Why or why not? Can you think of another? If we assume for the moment that we humans have something of the source of existence analogously in us, so to speak, does that grant us any moral capacity? Why or why not? If we say it does grant us moral capacity, what qualities does that give us? For instance, how does it affect our responsibilities? If we say it does not grant us moral capacity, what qualities does that give us? If we say it does or doesn't, what difference does it make for our behavior, for the way we live? What difference would it make to your life, your personal life, your family, your friends, your work, your community, or your political activism? If we assume for the moment that we have the sense and ethics to be co-creators, what qualities, rights, and responsibilities does that give us? If we assume we are co-creators, what difference would that make to the way you make decisions and choices, determine priorities, and behave? How would it affect your work, studies, life with family or friends, community, or political activism?